I mentioned, and you mentioned Shedeur Sanders as an interesting comp as we're talking about control and distractions and people around prominent NFL figures. Shedeur Sanders finally got drafted on day 3 of the draft. We're going to put up the board so you can see where all the quarterbacks went. He was the fifth round pick of the Cleveland Browns. He went behind Cam Ward, Jackson Dart, Tyler Shough, Jalen Milroe, and Dillon Gabriel. Dillon Gabriel was the surprise, right? That was a third round pick by the Browns as well. And then we can get to this in a second because I want to get Quinn Ewers all the way down there at the bottom, 14th quarterback taken in this draft. And he was, like a perfect 5-star recruit, highest ranked recruit ever coming into college. So we'll get to that in just one second. But Shedeur Sanders, 144th overall pick. So much lower than I think anyone expected. I think people, were arguing whether or not he'd go in the first round, but I didn't hear anything talking about the 5th round. What was your takeaway from seeing it actually all play out in Shedeur land in Cleveland, but not until day 3?
Well, I mean, the whole Cleveland getting him thing was very strange to me because I feel like they reached on Dillon Gabriel, and that's no shade to Dillon Gabriel because he, from some of the reports, had one of the best springs of any player, and in particular of any of the quarterbacks. So I could see how a team would fall in love with the guy with his experience, et cetera, who did really well in interviews and had a great Senior Bowl week and all of that. But it felt like a reach. And then the Browns in the 5th round circle back. They're like, hey, we're going to trade up in the 5th round to get Shedeur Sanders, who it looks like nobody else was really trying to get. So that whole thing is strange. I think I struggle with the NFL and where they like to draw lines on what's acceptable and what's not, because you have a league that will bring people in that put their hands on women and endanger children. You have a ownership and general managers who have probably supported people in very high places in this country that are just as loud, and they punch down and they name call. And they do all the different things that they say they don't want in their locker room, but it's good for the rest of us. And they're like, but Shedeur's a problem. So I struggle with how incongruent those things can be and how inconsistent these people are. Shedeur did himself no favors, though. He was not fully engaged in interviews per reports, and that's a really bad spot to be in. And he and Prime probably completely overestimated what teams thought of him. And the fall from being a 1st or 2nd round pick to the 5th is nuts. But teams have clearly drawn lines on what's acceptable in their locker room. And especially if you're a guy who has to develop for a year or two, you don't get to come in and be loud and make headlines. Like you need to fall back. And when it's time for you to play, you can play. So hopefully he goes into Cleveland, which he has an opportunity to be their quarterback, and gets back to work and does the things that made him a guy who, received Heisman votes and was offensive player of the year in his conference and all of that. So he can be successful in the league, but absolutely nuts.
And it's tough when you were waiting all that time and then you still go to the Cleveland Browns, a place that has had a really bad track record with quarterbacks.
Don't let the Browns fans hear you say that, because they were killing me on Twitter when I told
you're an
them.
Ohio guy.
Well, but here's the thing. When I said that their quarterback history was not great, they were like, what about Otto Graham? And I'm like, dog, that was the 40s. So, yes.
That makes your point for you. But no, that's the point, right? If you're going to be a late round pick, maybe you go somewhere that's like competing for championships, right? And that's the backup spot you walk into. That's not what he's walking into here. I continue to think how differently we would be thinking and talking about all of this if Dillon Gabriel and Shedeur Sanders were swapped. Like if the Browns did take both of them, but they took Shedeur in the 3rd round and then Dillon Gabriel in the 5th, I think we'd all be like, all right, that seems fine. Yeah. I don't think we would have this these conversations that have taken on a life of their own about what it means that the NFL didn't take Shedeur until the 4th round. Well, to me, what it means is that he wasn't being viewed as a starting quarterback. Sure. He was being viewed as a backup. I think that there were a lot of places that loved the quarterbacks in last year's class. A lot of them took him. And then I think that people are also more excited about next year's class, right? So there were only a few places that were interested, it seemed, in the quarterbacks from this class, and certainly very few as starters right out of the gate. And I think that it is, hey, what else do you want in your locker room? What else are you going to tolerate? Because again, if it's not like a can't miss guy, that's not an obvious like top 5 type player, then you allow for these other variables to come into play. And so yeah, I mean, maybe there's some broader, lessons learned about participating in things like the Senior Bowl, the combine. Like we did see guys that didn't participate in those fall lower than others. But I think that I don't know. It was shocking. It was truly
Yeah.
shocking how far he fell. But it feels like it was more the teams being like it's not worth everything else that
Yes.
comes with it, the potential headache. Which again, a lot of that is out of his control with his last name and the fact that he played for his dad. If he played
Well,
somewhere else and had a different last name, he goes earlier. But part of it is himself. If he is not, handling interviews well, if he's,
right.
he did a lot of things during the season that
Yes.
we pointed out at the time
Yes.
were not great. Throwing your offensive line under the bus after losing to
Yeah.
Nebraska, taunting opposing players with the Colorado CSU stuff. There were, the tweets about guys who left the Colorado program were like really upset and going through a lot mentally. There were a lot of things that he would have to look internally and point the finger as well. But to your overall point, now it's a clean slate.
Yes.
Now there's a million quarterbacks in this quarterback room, but no obvious starter, and you've
Yeah.
got a real chance there. You gotta prove something now. And I think again, like athletes sometimes invent chips on their shoulder. Like he does not need to invent that. He's got it now. And we'll see how he responds to
The synthesized chip is always one of my favorite athlete
it.
moves. I'll say this too is you know we've seen this in other situations, and I'm not saying this is like I think Prime is a bad guy or I think he's a bad parent, right? But like we've seen the quarterback dads, right? It's a real thing. It's somebody said it's like the dance mom, and I think it's a great comp there. And he's trying to do what he believes is best for his kid in a scenario where his kid is not him. Like Shedeur does not look like he's going to be a Hall of Famer. And part of me thinks that if he just had an agent that was not Prime, this might have been different because the guy
Yeah.
could have, it wouldn't be an echo chamber. Like, this is what I'm hearing from teams and like push back on the way Shedeur is behaving, and then can go to teams and make excuses for Shedeur that Prime probably wasn't doing throughout this process. Like, I think about that too.
Or you're just getting more realistic, feedback and information.
Sure.
Maybe people
Yes.
weren't
Somebody who's going to be
sugarcoating things.
honest.
Right.
And
Right. I
yeah,
think I
like they're
think that's
just going
I
to
think
give it
that's
to
a
you
really
straight.
good point. And
Yeah.
Shiloh had to go get a real agent as well.
Well,
And then he signed
Shiloh
an
said, "You
undrafted free
cutting the
agent.
cord, Dad. I got to fire you. Get out of here."
He did.
Shiloh
He
was a
did.
big winner from draft weekend, by the way.
Yeah, he looked like a great supportive brother throughout all of that. And then yeah, he signed a deal as an undrafted free agent.